did point out the different opinions as to how the Haftara developed and where it came from. Two main schools of thought. One school thought that it was always instituted that way, that when we had Nevi'im, when we had a Torah reading, we instituted Nevi'im to be read that connected to the Parasha. The other opinion says that at some point in our history we couldn't read the Torah because of the decrees of Antiochus at the time, dealing with 165 to 168 BCE. And so in replacement of the Torah reading, we're reading Nevi'im that relate to the Torah reading. Either opinion forced us, and will constantly force us when we're looking at Haftara, as to what's the connection to the Torah reading. Now, what is the Torah reading this week? There were a lot of topics in this week's Torah reading. There's not one topic, right? Korach is, yes, there was the Korach rebellion, and you had, after that, all the gifts to the Kohanim and the Leviim. This week's Parasha has a lot of different topics in Parashat Huqat. Right? We start with the first main topic is Para Aduma. It shifts then to Moshe hitting the rock and Moshe Aaron getting punished. It then speaks about the history of Bnei Israel trying to lead their way into Eretz Yisrael, because we're now in the 40th year. That's a very important point. This week's Parasha, we hit the 40th year. The whole prior generation died out. We're now in the 40th year. Bnei Israel trying to make their way around the Edom and Moab and Ammon and all the territories on the eastern side of the Jordan. Bnei Israel are trying to make their way through, and they get rejected. And on that way, on the course of that way, Aharon dies. Bnei Israel are taken captive in war, so they make a vow to God. If you save us, we're going to give something to God as a result. You have Bnei Israel complaining on the way, and they get punished with fiery serpents.
I feel like doing the Parasha.
Yeah, there's a lot of topics in the Parasha. And you will, and that's the point of this class. Through the Haftara, you will learn topics in the Parasha. And you finally have, after that, Bnei Israel are going through the territories of Sihon and Og. Right, the famous Sihon Melech HaEmori and Og Melech HaBashan. So the question is, what will be the Haftara? Right, what will be the appropriate Haftara to read in connection to our Parasha? And the ones that the Hachamim chose is Yiftach, the story in Navi, in Sefer Shoftim, of Yiftach, who was appointed by the people of Gilad as a leader to save them from the enemy known as Ammon. And we need to look at the Haftara before we even look at the source sheet. To look at the Haftara in these Chumashim, they're found on page 221. This is where our Haftara starts off. We're not going to read all 33 Pesukim in the Haftara. We're going to read certain portions of it, and we're going to get a good idea as to why it was chosen, and then just try to look into the Pesukim and see, is it just a superficial connection, or is there more than just meets the eye? And obviously it's more than just meets the eye. So here, Yiftach HaGiladi. It says Yiftach HaGiladi was a Gibor Hayil, and he's the son of an Isha Zonah, and Gilad gave birth to Yiftach, and Eshet Gilad has many other banim, but Yigdelu b'nei Isha, and what they do to Yiftach, they kicked him out of their house. They said, Lo tinhal bebet avinu, you will not inherit in our father's home, because you are a son of a different mother. You're a son of an Isha Zonah. Okay, that's how our Haftara starts off. Right? Positive, negative feeling about Yiftach already?
Negative.
What?
Negative.
Not good. Okay, not so good. You're starting off, Yiftach, he's a ben Isha Zonah. His brothers kick him out. Vayivrach Yiftach, and Yiftach runs away from his brothers. Vayeshev be'eretz tov. Which is interesting. I always wonder about these places. This place comes up elsewhere again in the Tanakh, a place called Eretz Tov. But this man who you just branded as not being good goes to a good land, and he doesn't get such good people with him. Empty people gather to Yiftach. Now why is Yiftach gathering to him empty people? And who are empty people and why?
Empty-handed men?
Maybe. But it seems like a lowly, base type of description of people. Not such... Right? What? Bandits. Right? It says here empty-handed man. I wouldn't translate it that way. They're empty-minded might be a better translation than empty-handed. Empty-minded men. Now, what'd you say?
No, I'm thinking like people that are empty. You could
They're no good
use
people.
them to your advantage because they have no
Right.
opinions. They have nothing to them.
You can even hire them to kill all your brothers if you're Avimelech. If you're Avimelech, a couple of chapters before, he hires Anashim Rekim. The exact term is used. He hires Anashim Rekim to go kill all of his brothers so that he could become the king. Right? So that's what's used
Rabbi,
earlier.
I see this very differently. I think the only adjective that Torah used to describe him was Gibor Chai.
Yes, correct.
So there's nothing about this character. He was born to a Zonah mother, which has
Right.
nothing to do with him. He's an innocent,
Good.
right? And Anashim Rekim, I think it's trouble. I think he was. I don't think he was a bad person. I think he was. He felt left out, maybe, of his family and like emotionally empty. And I think that's who
Good.
maybe.
So maybe we could prefer that reading because that doesn't make him to be a really bad guy, a really good guy. He's just not the greatest. He
was born into
good.
It's
Would you
unfortunate.
choose
It's
him?
not
Would
his
you
fault.
choose him to be the leader of your people?
No. If it says women, if the Torah describes him as Gibor, and this stage of Bnei Israel's journey, they needed a Gibor to lead them, then maybe.
Okay.
Something
Actually like that.
Gibor.
Actually like that. Actually, I'll tell you. I like that in terms of the needs. Here's the question: what are their needs? Let's look at what their needs are. It's a very good point because we need to be careful when we're reading Pesukim. See, I'm looking at it more of I already know the Avimelech story in a way, and it's kind of unfair. I already know this phrase from earlier where he hires Anashim Nekim, and he's the son of a Pilegish, and he's not necessarily welcome, and he becomes the leader by doing something that was improper. Here, Yiftach doesn't do anything improper. He just happens to be in a certain state and situation, and these are the people that gather to him because Hazid, he gets kicked out. So let's continue with this.
Not his fault.
When they're fighting with Israel, Ziknei Gilad come to take Yiftach from Eretz Tov. They want him. And they tell him, be our military leader, like used for the word Kasin. To fight Bnei Ammon, Yiftach turns to them and says, don't you hate me? Don't you hate me and you kicked me out of my father's house? You're only coming to me when you need me? They tell him, please come, we're bringing you back, and you'll come with us, and you'll come to us ahead to all of your Shevei Gilad. What does Yiftach answer? Vayomer Yiftach Ziknei Gilad, Im mishivim atem oti lachem bnei Ammon. If you bring me back to fight, actually I would say this is a good character of Yiftach here. He uses God's name. Benatan Adonai otam lefanai. If God gives them to me, ben anochi yeh lachem lerosh.
I love him.
Right? Vayamru Ziknei Gilad, and actually he went to history class. Clearly, you'll see. Vayamru Ziknei Gilad Yiftach. Ziknei Gilad tell Yiftach, Adonai yeshomea benotenu imloch yitbarecha ken naaseh. Ziknei Gilad tell Yiftach, God will be the listener, imloch yitbarecha, meaning we'll do what you said. What is the threat of Ammon at that time? What does Ammon even want from Bnei Israel? Why are they fighting with us? Not only why are they fighting with us, well if you looked earlier into the earlier chapter, they're actually crushing Bnei Israel for many years. 18 years. They're crushing us. The words used, Vayid Asu Vayrosesu. They're stomping us to the extent that we're in such a dire need of help. What do they want from us? Why is Ammon fighting us? So Yiftach asks them the same question. And if you want, that's actually in your source sheet in Hebrew English as well, but I know you have Hebrew English as well anyway. Vayishlach Yiftach melachim el melech bnei Ammon le'emor. Mali valach, why are you coming to fight in my land? What do you want from us? You know what we want? We want our land back. You stole our land. Kilakah Yisrael et arsi ba'alotim mitzrayim me'arnon ve'ad hayabok. The Arnon Wadi to the Yabok Wadi. Wish I had a map here in front of me. I have this kind of map here. I didn't make enough copies. You need an extra source sheet? Yeah. I have some extras actually. Here's another. I know I made a lot. I'm like, great, I have over 20 women here. Excellent. So, I apologize for having a map here. I should have a map with me over here. But I'm going to use this right now as my map, okay? I apologize for now. I did it last night in the class, and people all looked in the room as if like, whoa, it's just a map. Here's your Jordan over here. Here, Bnei Yisrael coming from the south. They're coming up. Yeah, you have Edom over here on the bottom. Okay? You have Moab over here, Sihon here, and Ammon over here. History 101 that Yiftach wants to teach the king of Ammon and the people of Moab that completely know it. Sihon's territory over here once belonged to Melech Moab. Look at the top of the source sheet. When we decided to fight Sihon, who wouldn't let us pass through, and we conquered it, it tells us in the bold, the end of the first source, Ki Heshbon ir Sihon melech Amorihi. Heshbon was the city of Sihon. Vehu nilham, because he fought Melech Moab Harishon. Moab originally had a larger territory. Sihon took that over. So instead of Moab and Ammon, you end up Moab, Sihon, Ammon. Bnei Yisrael take this territory. They're saying this belongs to us. We want it back. We want it back. If it helps to look at it, I don't know if it does. I can send this around. You can send this around if you want. If you want to look at the map over there. But you have again Edom in the most south portion, Moab, Sihon, and Ammon. They want that whole territory back. Because if you think about it, Moab and Ammon were a family. They both come from Lot. So they want to be connected also. This kind of disconnected them. Sihon. They're claiming Bnei Yisrael did this. Bnei Yisrael took over our territory. We want it back. That's the territory from what's known as Arnon ad Yabok. They're wadis, right? Smaller bodies of water that only fill up with water in the rainy seasons. Until the Ammon territory, you have a chunk that they're saying belongs to us. We want it. Yiftach tells them, go back to history class. You didn't go to history class. You're the king of Ammon, and you don't know the history. That's what he tells them. He says, "Vayosef od Yiftach vayishlach malachim ech be'Ammon vayomer lo in the bold ko amar Yiftach lo lakach Yisrael et eretz Moab et eretz bnei Ammon." We did not take it. Yiftach knows the history.
Wait a minute, we took it because God told us that He's giving us that land.
No, we didn't take it from Ammon. We took it from Sihon.
Oh, well, we still took it.
We're saying we didn't take it from you. Sihon melech HaAmori took it from you.
Got it, right.
And by the way, you can ask a question. They took it from Moab. Why is Ammon the one complaining? They're one and the same. They probably shared that similar god known as Chemosh. They shared a family. They both come from Lot. Right? Lot had two sons/grandsons. It sounds a little weird saying that, but it's true.
Oh, that's interesting because Yiftach was also illegitimate. And one Moab illegitimate, one was illegitimate.
Interesting.
Just clicked in my head.
Interesting. So in a way, you have this, this argument of, right, Yiftach to Moab and Ammon, right, to be able to do that.
Mediate, because
Interesting.
we have that.
Moab, what does the name mean? What does Moab mean from dad? Me'av, and Ben Ami was the name of the, right, Bereshit Pei. Ben Ami, who from that becomes Ammon. They're brothers. So as brothers, they're arguing for this territory. Yiftach goes through a whole history. But what I want to point out is the bottom of the first source sheet. He tells Ammon, Ve'ata Adonai Elohei Yisrael. God conquered the Amori for us. When Sihon didn't let us pass through, he first tells them, we wanted to just pass through and buy food and water. We weren't going to attack. We just wanted to easily end up in Eretz Canaan. Let us pass through. Edom didn't let us. Moab didn't let us. We couldn't fight anyone. We were not allowed to. The only reason we even fought to get this territory is because Vayetzeh Sihon Melech Heshbon. Right? We fought against Sihon. We captured this territory. So now, you want to argue with us? Yiftach is very wise. He tells them, if your God wants to conquer it for you, Fadal. Sure. If your God really wants to fight with our God, If you think this is your territory, whatever your God Chemosh is the God of Moab. We know that from this week's Parasha. Avadta am Chemosh is in Perek Kaf Aleph in Bemidbar. It's in the Parasha. And whenever God conquers for us, that's what we conquered. And he says, didn't you learn the lesson? You're from Moab and Ammon. Do you know that guy Balak? You remember him? That king? Did Balak try to fight with us? Balak tried to curse us because he couldn't start a battle with us without trying to curse us. And so he says, Ve'ata hatov tov ata mi Balak ben Tzipor melech Moab. Are you any better from Balak? Harov Rav Yisrael? Did he fight with us? What are you doing? He says, you're not learning the lesson of history. Beshevet Israel, when we sat in Heshbon and all these cities for 300 years, Shel Shmeot Shana, and you did not come with any arguments. 300 years have passed. I think we're in verse 26. 300 years have passed, and you haven't said a word. And now you want to say something. All of a sudden, comes out of the blue. You took our land. It must have been that Ammon and Moab were struggling for territory. It must have been that they wanted more land. And at this point, they come with an argument that's baseless. And that's what Yiftach tells them. So the first connection to Aparasha is this. Knowing the history of what happened, knowing the history of Sihon coming out to fight with us, and we're conquering his territory, and that territory was conquered, but it's the only territory, that and Og's, in that vicinity that we were allowed to conquer. Because there's an entire chapter in Sefer Devarim, chapter 2, which says we can't fight with Edom because he's our brother, Esav. We can't fight with Moab, and we can't fight with Ammon. So the only territories that we took, Sihon and Og, were not our family members. Add to this, you're our family. What are you doing? Go back in time to more history. Avraham Avinu wanted to let you stay wherever you wanted at its Canaan. You chose your own territory. You chose it based on whatever considerations of Sedom. We should have been one and the same. And yet, when we came to pass through your territories, what did you say? What did Melech Moab say? What does Yiftach say? Melech Moab said no. Look at the Pasuk. It says, Pasuk Yod Zayin, page 222. Vayishlach Yisrael Malachim el Melech Edom lemor. Epirena be'arsecha. Let's go through your land, your territory. Velo Shama Melech Edom. V'gam Melech Moab shalach velo ava. Edom didn't let, Moab didn't let, and we stayed in Kadesh because we couldn't. So what do? We end up going around, but we didn't attack you in any way for you to want to attack us. So it teaches us, which is, I think it's fascinating to think about. Even Edom, in the first place, Edom, to not be able to fight them because they're Esav. Look throughout history what the people of Esav did to us throughout history. You're telling us we can't fight because it's their territory, or Ammon and Moab. Look what Ammon and Moab are doing to us, and yet it's still within our blood to not want to have a fight. Yiftach wants to avoid the fight because that's what Bnei Israel are told by God. This is their territory. This is theirs. It belongs to them. Do not take it. They don't want to let us through. And Edom actually wanted to threaten us through war to not let us go through. And eventually we have to leave away from that. So it teaches a lesson of we don't want to take things without being asked to. B is the next part of the Haftara. Right, so that's the first part. It's this whole connection of history of how the lands were conquered and this whole fight over land. That's the first connection.
I'm actually, the more I get to know Yiftach, the more I like him. I think that of course he was a Gibor and he could have easily fought them right away. The first thing he did was have a conversation with them. Guys, listen, maybe there's a misunderstanding. We didn't take it from you. Right? So he had a conversation before he used his might. He said that his might isn't his own; it's Hashem's. So I just feel like he's
right. So he's
a really good guy.
Right.
Like even at the end. Okay. But
so let's get
so he kept his
next
word. He made the promise.
next part of class. Next part of class is exactly that, which is exactly, so it's a good question, right? Do you view a person based on what we know about him from later? Do you judge a person based on, like Noah, right? Take Noah and take the same question, right? Do you take Noah and look at what happened after with when he gets drunk and naked in his tent, and you view it backwards into what he was earlier? Or characters have different points in their life as to what we view them as a person, right? Often we judge Noah very much so on things that happen later, and we even read them to earlier, right? So it's a good question. How much do we separate? Can we separate? Listen, look at the way he's acting and what's going to happen now. When they don't want to let his words quiet him down, what does he do? Look at, this is the next connection to the Parasha. Look at page 2 in the source sheet. What happens? So look at the second source and we'll go backwards to our Parasha. Vatehiyal yiftach ruach Adonai. Vayabor et Gilad vet Menashe. Vayavor mispeh Gilad. So we're on the eastern side of the Jordan right now. All those territories, Gilad and Menashe, we're talking about Chatzi Menashe, on the eastern side of the Jordan. Vayidar yiftach neded ladonai vayomar inaton titenet bnei Amon biyadi. Yiftach makes a vow and says, if God surely gives Ammon in my hands. That connects perfectly to Aparasha, because when Bnei Israel are being attacked by the Knaani Melech Arad, in the top source on page 2, and they fight Israel and they take captives, Vayidar Yisrael Nedel Adonai Vayomar, Im Naton Titenet Am Hazeh Biyadi. It's in the singular, it's the same exact language. If you give, right, Vayidar, you have the vow. Israel vowed to God saying, if you surely give, Seli Yiftach, right? What did Bnei Yisrael vow? We'll prescribe the towns that we capture. What happens in the Torah? Vayishma Adonai B'Kol Yisrael. God listens to Israel, gives them the Kanaani. They prescribe them in their cities, and they deliver the Canaanites in their hands, and they call the place Chorma. In our case, God listens too. What is Yiftach's vow? V'haya hayoseh asher yetzeh midateh beti likrati b'shuvi b'shalom b'nei Ammon. When I come back in peace from Bnei Ammon, if I do, the first that comes likrati to
Greet me.
the second you use the word to greet me, I know the problem with that is if you say to greet me, I know. I know. The problem with greet is that it indicates humans much more so than it does animals. So it kind of, even though greet can be an animal. Listen, people, unless he had someone very, very close in terms of an animal because remember he had only one kid, right? So it's very possible. Ve'aya ladonai ve'halitiu olah. It will be to God, and I will make whatever it is an olah. Right? By the way, our Haftara is Chachamim are very wise. They stop the Haftara for two reasons. One, because the latter part doesn't connect at all to our Parasha. And B, because do we want to end on that? Even though according to a certain portion of Chazal, he didn't actually sacrifice her, he let her be a virgin in the hills who never married her whole life. So she just kind of gets isolated, and they say that her friends came to visit her. I don't read it that way. I have a very hard time reading it that way. I've learned that Shita. I've learned it from Hazal. I've learned it from Parshanim who've said it that way. Very hard for me to read it that way.
What does the Torah say? Nothing?
The Torah about what?
After that, I'm saying.
The Tanakh?
Yeah.
It just ends on the note. It'd be helpful. I don't have a Tanakh here in front of me.
You think that he killed her?
Yeah.
Yeah, there it is. I'll read you.
What do you think of this? People,
But I don't think that means anything. I think
I'll read you. I'll read you the Pesukim. It says. Don't talk. It's okay. Fine with me. I like this. It's better than my class.
But also, think of it in terms of Judaism. What's the lesson of this? Right.
Here we go.
Yeah. That's what
To actually read. I like to talk better than my class. It's good.
Doesn't mean it's there.
Right.
be worse than your.
No, I like the talking better than me speaking. It's good. It means you're discussing the topic.
Okay, it's good.
This is called good talking. You know, it
So
means
was it a mistake to use that verb, l'kra, to call, whatever?
no. I think the Hachamim all said it was a mistake to just utter this vow in the first place.
Yeah.
It says, Tov asher lo tidor mishetidor velo teshalem. It's better to not vow than to vow and not pay it. There's also one where it says, V'chi tehdal lindor lo yeh becha chet. If you hold back from vowing, there won't be any sin. Don't worry. People will still think you're a holy, righteous person if you don't
So
vow.
what was the whole point?
People were very used to vowing, and people felt that when you did it, it was like a high esteemed. I'm vowing to God, you know.
So that's about a little bit of an arrogant moment for him?
So that Hazal actually viewed him as arrogant to the extent that not arrogant. They viewed him and the leaders at the time who could have annulled his vow as he didn't want to go and annul it, and the Kohen. The leader at the time didn't want to come. I want to go to the Siftach person to help him annul the vow. There's something going on with leadership at the time that the Hazal say was so low that no one wanted to go to each other in order to make this vow annulled.
I mean, all this poor girl.
Right.
Was
He
there anything
also
else?
usually uses that.
So
Of course I meant an animal that comes next to you. but I didn't mean-
So they say over here, Vatomed Elav Avi. She tells.
He may have made it to himself.
Well, she tells her father. Her father. He tells her what the vow is. He tells her. He rips his clothes. First of all,
Afterwards, isn't it?
no. He rips his clothing after the vow, and he says, I opened my mouth and I cannot take it back. And she tells him, Father, you opened your mouth to God. Do to me whatever came out of your mouth. After God gave you vengeance against your enemies. Vatomer elavia ye'aseh. And she repeats it again to him, which means he was silent at that moment. And she says to him, Ye'aseh li hadavar hazeh. Let this thing be done to me. Give me 2 months. I'll go cry with either my friends or me and my friend. Vayomed lechi. She goes for 2. Oh, you're in the actual Tanakh? You're not. I wasn't expecting to make this a huge focus, but I'm okay with making it. But without the Tanakhs in front of us, you can't, you know. Vayishlach ota sheneh chodashim. He sends her for 2 months. Vatelech bera'yotea. She goes with her friends. Vatibk al betulea al harim. They say she's crying on her virginity. They view that as she didn't have kids. Either you view it she didn't have kids and she's going to get killed, or she didn't have kids and she's going to stay not being able to have kids. 2 ways of reading it. Vayimi ketz, listen what it says. Vatashov elavia, vayas la, and he did to her et nidro asher nadar. He did to her the vow which he vowed. I don't need to say more.
I think they're both foolish.
But the next part says vehi lo yadea ish. She did not know any man. Vatihok Israel. And every year the girls of Israel would go up letanot to eulogize or to cry lebat yiftach giladi arbaat yamim bashana. 4 days a year they would go up. Either way, there seems to be something negative here. Now we don't want to necessarily project it, and I love Sharon how you're reading it. Don't necessarily project it back to how you read it. There's multiple readings, right? When I first read this, it must have been 10, 12 years ago when I was teaching the story of Yiftach. I made a connection between Avimelech and Yiftach almost immediately because of the fact that the text identifies their mothers as illegitimate. There are many brothers who don't necessarily want him as anything.
Like David.
Empty people, both have anashim rekim, and then, you know, you have this idea of leadership. The difference is, which I pointed out that time ago, was Avimelech was nothing to do with God. Yiftach wants everything to do with God. And that even in Yiftach's weakest moment, even in his weakest moment of what he did would not necessarily view as something good, he was still trying to do it to God. Which means even in the moment where he was uttering a vow that we might view as something to be a little bit, he did it too quickly, and which why the name Yiftach might be very appropriate for him. So it's important to view of he was still doing a neder ladonai. Vayidar Yiftach neder ladonai vayomar hayatzoa, making an olah. It reminds me of Hannah in a way. right? When you're viewing it that way, you start to make different connections in Tanakh of she was pouring herself out and she says, whoever it is, I'll sacrifice him to God. Well, she meant it as giving him to the Mishkan, which is, she knew she was doing something. So that even in the way that he formulated it, which allowed it to be a human being, was the negative, you can still view a positive part of it. For me, though, I look more also as context. Right? What's going on before this story? What state are Israel in this story? To view as what's going on in history, what's going on in current events when Yiftach comes on the scene. What's happening? And what's happening is what I told you before, that Bnei Yisrael are being oppressed and trampled by their enemies. And what happens? What happens is the bottom of the page, the bottom of page 2. ויעברו בני עמון את הירדן להילחם גם ביהודה, בנימין ובית אפרים. They're not only coming to attack the people on the eastern side of the Jordan. They're coming into Judah, into Binyamin and Ephraim. ותסר לישראל מאוד. And they are overcoming Israel in terms of their suffering. ויזעקו בני ישראל לנדם. And what did Bnei Yisrael turn to God and say? חטאנו לך. We've sinned to you because we left our God and we worship the Baalim. They not only worship the Baalim, the Pesukim earlier indicate 7 different gods that Bnei Yisrael worshipped during the time that led God to bring them in the hands of their enemy. Right? The way the Pesukim speak about it is the gods of the Moabites, the gods of the Ammonim, the gods of the Pelishtim, the gods of the Sidonim, all these different gods that Bnei Yisrael are worshipping at the time. And God says, forget it. I'm not going to save you anymore. That's what God says. That's what's happening right before the story in Yiftach. I am done with you. I've had it. You're going to all these different gods.
Where is that?
I want nothing, not here. I'm going to get there soon. I'm giving you the first statement of it, where maybe I need like a 6-page source sheet next time. I'll do it. It's okay. I have the ink for it. Why not? You know.
In this source it says the chuv is akuh.
Wait. So I want to give before we get to that. You have a few pesukim before, which is they worshipped. I'll read it. Be'alim, Ashtarot, the gods of Aram, the gods of Sidon, the gods of Moab, the gods of Ammon, the gods of Pelishtim. It gives you like a history of what they're doing. And God says, I'm out. And
Where
then
is that? That's why I just no, I know it's not here.
it's going to
Where
be
is
here,
it?
right here. It's going to be here. Right here. So it's in Hebrew only. Vayomer Adonai El Bnei Yisrael Halo Mitzrayim Min Amori Umin Bnei Ammon Umin Pelishtim. I saved you from Egypt, from the Amori, from Ammon, from Pelishtim, from Sidonim, from Amalek, from Maon. Lachasu etchem. Vatitzaku elai, and you cried to me. Va'oshia etchem miyadam, and I saved you. Ve'atem azavtem oti. You left me. Vata'abdu Elohim achenim. Lachen lo osif. I'm not going to continue to save you. I am out. I don't want this relationship anymore. Leave me alone. This is dire. This is a very negative state. This is worse than if you ever learned the introduction to Shoftim, where it gives you the cycle of Shoftim. The cycle keeps repeating himself, and it gets worse and worse. It gets worse in chapter 6 before Git'on, and it gets very bad here.
When it says Vayomer Hashem El Bnei Yisrael, the dialogue was going through who?
It's a great question. There always seems to be some sort of like a malach or a navi that seems to say it. Because who's their leader here? There's no shofet. It's a great question. Who is he saying it to? I need a Mikra'ot Kedolot right now to look that up. That's a fantastic question. I never noticed that. But even if he is, who is God saying it to?
He said that in Talmud, it's a narration.
No, it's God saying it to Bnei Israel. It's a dialogue between Bnei Israel and God through who? Probably some sort of a Navi that was existing throughout the time period who kept on telling Bnei Israel. Probably. But it's a great question I need to
Well,
research.
the Bnei Yisrael, like it's, yeah.
Good.
Okay.
Good. Good for the next time I teach it. No, great, actually. Very good. Because again, it makes you question who's the dialogue between and who. And he does. Lechu v'za'aku el ha'elohim asher behartem bam. Go cry out to the gods that you chose. Him ma yoshia lachem be'etzaretchem. Let them help you. Vayomru b'nei Yisrael Adonai hatanu. They tell God we sin. Aseh atalanu kechol atov b'einecha. Do that's what's good in your eyes. However, just save us today.
Is that teshuvah of any sort?
What?
Is that any teshuvah?
Look what happens next. Vayasidu, it's a great question. Is that teshuvah? Is that really teshuvah? We want a band-aid, please, for now. Give me a band-aid. Vayasidu et Elohei nechad. They removed their gods from their midst. Vayavdu et Adonai vatiksad nafsho be'amal Yisrael. And God is short-spirited. He can't handle it anymore. He has to save them. When I was preparing this class yesterday, and I said, this sounds a lot like Bnei Yisrael in the Suits Parasha. You know, they're arguing for water. God says, okay, I'm not angry at you. I'll get you water from the rock. Then they need to be saved, and they make a nedid, and God saves them. But right after the nedid, what happens? Look at the source right above the one we were just reading. Vayis'u mehorahar. They start to travel throughout the desert in Aparasha. Lisbobet eretz Edom, to circle Edom. Vatiksar nefesh ha'am badarech. And they become short-spirited. And what does God send them? The fiery serpents, because they're talking against God. We want water, we want food. And God sends them fiery serpents to bite them. And when they come to Moshe, vayomeru chatanu. And they come and they said, we've sinned. And I said, oh, it sounds similar. And it does. Even the same words come up in our story. And it gets you to start to think, what is real teshuvah? I think that our Haftara does a good job of connecting it with the questions of our history and nedarim. But an additional point is brought up, again, when you look at the full context. And you ask yourself, what is teshuvah? Our Parasha brings up a very strange but important story of the Nechash Nechoshet, of Bnei Israel complaining, and they're bitten by fiery serpents for doing so. And what is the teshuvah? How do you live if you got bit by the fiery serpent? What do you do?
He makes a copper.
Moshe makes a copper serpent and he puts it on a nes, which does not mean a miracle. It means a staff. It means a pole. And you look up. 1 second. You're going to create a physical symbol that's going. So the Mishnah asks in Mishnah Roshana, Perek Gimel Mishnah Het, V'chi Nahash, like Moshe Rabbeinu's hands. There's a Nahash, there's a serpent that you look up. You need to do teshuvah. Go look at that item. Great way. You know, go start to put things on yourself and put amulets. We don't do that today, no. Put amulets on yourselves and start to pray to them. And maybe if you start to put some things on you and you might wear, maybe God will start to answer you. What? That's what we do? That's teshuvah? Says the Mishnah, no. It was a symbol of their sin. And you're looking at your sin in the face. And when you do that, you're looking up at God. Because you're looking and you're saying, first of all, you have to look upward. It's on this.
Makes sense.
And you're looking up. And when you're looking up, well, the part about looking at your sin was I found different mefarshim, which is great. You're looking at your sin in the face and you're saying, I need to look at my problem and solve it. What did I do wrong here? So it's like you're being bit, you're bit, and you're in pain from this serpent, and you have to look at it. Look at what you did wrong. Look at what you did wrong. But the Mishnah goes even further. No, it's not look at what you did wrong. It's more than that. The Mishnah goes even further and says, look at God. Look up to God. That's your teshuvah. The problem becomes is that years later, that item becomes an avodah zarah item. Years later, this nechash nechoshet becomes a snare for Bnei Yisrael that even a king called Chizkiah in Melachim Bet Perek Yodchet has to cut down this item that becomes a snare because they couldn't even do real teshuvah per se. That the teshuvah, when it's superficial, when it becomes something that's just a band-aid, if you treat it as a band-aid, it's not going to work. So the question is, did Bnei Israel do teshuvah in the story of this week's Parasha?
No, they did it in response. It sounds like they did it in response to
You know what's weird about this story? It doesn't actually say a plague stopped or people stopped dying. It just gave the formula for if you look at the Nechash Nechoshet, you live. It doesn't say, and people did, it just says, whoever was bitten and looked at it lived. But it kind of gives it in a way that seems to be more of a description of the formula rather than X amount of people did it and lived. We don't know. Because Because for me, the same story comes up again. When, at the end of the Balak story, God's saving us from Zichon and Og and everyone, and what happens at the end of the Balak story? We're doing Avodah Zarah again. And the question you have to ask yourself is, I asked the same question, I don't have an answer for it. Why is God allowing some sort of this sort of relationship? Look at Yiftach's story. He allows them to say, we want a Band-Aid, but then do after what you want to us. And God is so short-spirited that he let us do it. Why?
Because he loves us.
If you loved us, you wouldn't let us do that.
Yeah, but he knew that they would die if he didn't. So you know what? Sometimes you give in to your kids, you know, like for the long term of the relationship.
So my partial answer of it, which you knocked down to an extent, which is very good. I was going to say, like, even the leader that they got was not your exemplary leader. Meaning, when they asked for help, what's the help that they got? So part of it was going to a direction of you kind of get, and so this last week, you kind of get the leader that you're going to ask for. You want something superficial. I'll give you something superficial. You're not necessarily going to get the greatest leader. We could still have that reading to an extent, but you kind of, which is good. This is why I love classes. I love teaching it because when I taught it last, it was, look at the leader you get, and you kind of said, no, look, they got a leader. Okay, good. But again, what the Chachamim tell us about that time period, let's start with that. The time period that they say is, Yiftach didn't want to annul the vow, and the Kohen didn't want to come to Yiftach because you didn't have people working together. Is, yeah, I'll help you out, but you have to help yourself out too. Right? And part of that might be what you said, Sharon, is they kind of did. They worked out an issue that they had. They kicked someone out and they brought him back, and they may have worked out things of, so what did that relationship remind you of kicking someone out and then bringing them back?
Awesome God.
Yeah.
That's mirroring.
Kicking someone out and bringing them back. You know when Yiftach says, now you need me when you need me, but you kicked me out before? Reminds me a lot about the relationship with God. Which means the leader is even saying, it's all superficial the way you want it. It'll only work if you have God. So I've adopted a new reading now. Yiftach is teaching them, if you want to succeed, you got to bring God into the picture. It can't be when you need it, I just need it and I'm out. You need the godly element there all the time. So that when Yiftach is gone, and when Shofet is gone, you can't, in a way, function to say, I need a leader. And that's the only way it's going to work. One thing I am certain about, and even if you view Yiftach as positive, I do see the Shoftim that we had originally. You can't compare Yiftach to Devorah. You can't compare Yiftach to Otniel ben Kenaz and Ehud ben Gera. The text seems to tell us something about, they're still different characters. They're not the same. The trajectory of Shoftim kind of is going like this.
Because the people
Right,
are also...
right. And when you're doing that, you're ending up with a question you have to ask yourself. I'm not going to deal with Shimshon. Shimshon was a Haftara that we missed. That was an important Haftara. But you need to ask yourself a question. You many times read it, and you've read it as, is it a hero or is it a tragic figure when you look at Shimshon? And you look at the time periods that Bnei Yisrael are living in. And you look at the reflection of leadership. And you look at the result of how Bnei Yisrael are behaving and how they're acting. And you look at when society is a reflection of leadership and how people are behaving, what are Bnei Yisrael getting in return? And what do we get in return when we're behaving in a certain way? As a people, what type of leadership do we get? What type of actions do we get in our society? And how that builds its way through the generations. And what we allow. And what we allow to function. Right? So this person gets kicked out as a leader and says, come back. And then you have the Yiftach story with his daughter. And do we allow it? Do we not allow it? Why do the people around them allow it? Do we allow someone to be sacrificed as a human? Is that something that we want? And do people around just keep silent? Or do we allow that type of behavior? Do we allow Bnei Yisrael to just hop around from God to God and just say, here's a Band-Aid. And it's fine, it's okay. Rip the Band-Aid off after and just destroy us. But right now we want to be saved. How healthy is that relationship with God? And how often do we do that? That is the danger of the Nechash Nechoshet. That message is the danger of the nechash nechoshet that became the nechushtan, the easy band-aid fix. Because Bnei Yisrael end up making the nechash nechoshet an avodah zarah called nechushtan, and they service it. They make it into an easy fix, and an idol, and an amulet, and a hams, and something that's going to easily fix all of their problems with an easy snap of the fingers, versus actually truly introspecting and saying, what do we need to do?
So I have a question that you said before. The girls went to visit the daughter for 4 years. Does that mean?
No, 4 days out of the year.
Okay, I thought you said.
No, 4 yamim bashana, 4 days. It seems to be like a ritual. They would
But,
go
okay,
to cry
but
about
if they
her.
went to visit her, that means
Ah.
that she was alive, or
So there
did
was-
they visit a grave?
So there's 2 ways of reading it. Either they went to mourn her and visit her grave, or visit her.
Didn't it say
In person.
But it says what
No,
was the word?
yetanu, yetanu.
No, it says it's davar, that she was guilty, sounds like.
It's less ambiguous.
It wasn't so ambiguous though.
I don't think it was Vayasla and Nidrash and Adad. He did her to her the neder that he made. What's the neder that he made? Allah. So
Or you could say the neder that he made was that she didn't have any offsprings and that he
That's
killed
true.
her.
but that's not the neder Hashem Adar though. That's hard to read it that way. But Hazal do. There's a big strand of Hazal that read it that way. So can't totally reject that reading.
I think also you see that the story reflects the time period of the people, because you see, like, this story sounds eerily similar to Abraham and Yitzchak and the Akedah, like the Olah, sacrificing a child. But when one thing is godly ordained and when it's not, there's like a very, very, very fine line of it being a bad thing to do and it being something that God told you to do. Also with the Nechash Nechoshet, in the beginning, it's something that God prescribed, and afterwards it becomes
Wow, I
something
like that a lot.
that becomes avodah zarah.
Good. So what I liked about that is, I'll add to that, it's the same approach of taking of when God allowed certain things, let's say in the Torah, where you gave certain halachot of the Torah, sacrifices, things like that we do, that may have been something of neighboring nations, but God prescribes it. It's not avodah zarah, it's avodat Hashem. So when you do it in a certain way and it's prescribed by God, I'll give you a good example of that, the Kiruvim. Always perplexed by the Kiruvim. But God said to do it. It's not avodah zarah. But it is, but it's not, because right, the nechash nechoshet. It's prescribed by God, and you would never do it, but it's prescribed by God, but it becomes service of God. That fine line becomes very hard to ride, because the nechash nechoshet becomes that nechushtan, that becomes a snare for Bnei Yisrael. But you're right, when it becomes something that God prescribes versus man-made.
Right. But why is God prescribing it in the first place? It's because man demanded it or needed it.
Right.
So,
We all need physical symbols, we all need physical connections, but what we do with it is important, right? How we interact with it is important.
It's like today we're almost like back to quick symbols and sound bites instead of, while they're dying and this disease and the snakes, it wasn't time for God to say, let me teach you about Teshuvah. It wasn't going to happen. A lot of them are illiterate. They don't get the new system. I need a quick symbol. So like almost, I hate to say back here today. I just like,
Right,
on Instagram here. Here's a symbol for what I mean.
Isn't it crazy
It's
though
happening.
that what you just described in terms of the symbol of nechash nechoshet hasn't changed in thousands of years?
It's the medical symbol.
No. That's not what I meant. I meant in terms of people needing to use symbols as a quick fix of a physical item that becomes I wear something on me and it solves all my issues and I'm done for. I mean, I don't need to do more and really do something. That's a quick fix. And nothing changes in thousands and thousands and thousands of years. Nothing has changed because humans always want. So you're saying it's not time to educate. When is it time to educate? And when even it is, we can't even get it done. So it's
prior to the crisis.
It's
Scary.
when everyone's comfortable, like it's not, it's when it's the stress that.
It's a test.
so thank you all for joining class.
Thank you.
Next week's